Paul, thanks so much for joining us on the Daily Aus this morning.
Thank you very much.
So I want to talk to you about this new proposal for age assurance technology to bar children from online porn. What's the problem we're trying to solve here?
So fundamentally, there is an ongoing issue, as you know, with gender-based violence. This is something that has been in the news a great deal recently. There are a whole series of factors contributing to mainly male on female violence. It isn't unique to specific genders, but there is a growing social concern of gender-based violence. And part of the underlying reasons for it is certainly a perception that there is a link between access to adult content. In more recent years, there's been a much greater level of accessibility to this sort of content. And some would argue that the nature of the content has become of more concern. Certainly more aggressive is the words that I'm hearing being used. So there's this growth in access to content that we believe is influencing behaviors and attitudes and opinions, particularly in terms of consensual relationships and safe relationships. And so there is a desire to look at a solution. What can we do to try and control access to certain levels and types of information? And the recent announcements, it's part of a whole flurry of initiatives to target gender-based violence. But part of that is to look at how we can implement a trial in looking at age assurance or age verification technologies, something that can limit who has access to these kinds of adult content.
So essentially what you're saying is kids are discovering pornography slightly younger, and the pornography itself tends to be of a more violent nature. And that combination together is, we think, could be contributing towards this culture where we're seeing more gender-based violence.
Indeed, and I think some of the statistics that are being talked about are really quite concerning. So, referring to the E-Safety Commissioner, which is a body that makes recommendations in relation to online safety and other issues, particularly in the current environment of people having almost unfettered access to the internet. And I'm just reading one of the statistics now. 75% of children who are aged between 16 and 18 have experienced some form of online pornography. Now, that in itself is perhaps not too shocking. 16 to 18-year-olds, you may think, okay, they could probably are equipped to deal with that. And I guess if you reflect the education system, by the time someone has reached 16 to 18, they would have been exposed to all sorts of educational interventions about relationships, intimacy, and sex. But when you then dig into the data, a third of them were exposed before the age of 13.
Yeah,
So
it's
these are
very young.
really young kids being exposed to online pornography. And we know that the nature of material in online pornography is very variable, but does have levels of aggression. And half of them saw it between age 13 and 15, really in the sort of formative years.
We've got our heads around this problem that exists, and now we can turn to the solutions in front of us. I heard you mention age assurance before and verification. Is there a difference between those two terms?
There is, and for many it's a subtle difference. But I'll give you a very simple example. If you were to go and visit a website that sells alcohol, and there's a few examples that people will think of in their mind now, one of the first things that you'll be asked when visiting that website is, are you over 18?
Or you put in your age and say what year you were
You
born?
do, yes. So you type in and that's the extent of the validity or the verification of your age. A website asks you, are you an adult? And that can be through how many years old are you versus what is your date of birth. And really, a lot of the approaches that are being taken at the moment to control access to adult material are based around either the concept of, are you old enough? Or do you have something that you can show us or that you can demonstrate that you are older? And that typically is through a credit card. And a lot of people are concerned about that because they don't want it appearing on their credit card bill.
Yeah.
But it's really the only mechanisms that are currently actively in use.
Is the reason why an alcohol website or an adult website asks you for that date of birth, is that a liability thing and they're shifting that liability to you as the user?
Effectively, it's their demonstration of due diligence. So they
Right.
can hide behind it. It's very similar to terms and conditions on a product or a service that you subscribe to. The vendors, the suppliers, all know full well that we don't read any of that information. And if you go and buy alcohol online or you buy a service, that organization knows full well that a number of the responses will be falsified. So it's hiding behind it. They probably don't have access to many other solutions.
Hello, I'm James and I produce the video you're watching. If you're enjoying what you're watching, we'd love it if you considered subscribing and checking us out on our other platforms. It'd really help in getting the word out about what we're doing here at TDA. Thanks very much, and now back to the deep dive.
So what are the more rigorous approaches out there then?
So that's when we move into sort of what we call age verification. Now that can be something very simple. However, there are lots of other approaches. And I think when we talk about the trial that is being proposed in Australia, what we're likely to see there is a tie-in with government and probably utilizing something like the MyGov ID, the newly developed or redeveloped digital ID that provides a level of verification. And I think what's important to note here is it's very much like when you apply for a credit card online, you will often verify your identity, the 100-point check, entirely online. You'll do it digitally without providing any documents. And it's a mechanism by which, for example, your driver's license is passed on to the issuing authority. So in my case, I'm in Western Australia. So I would enter my details of my driver's license, and they would then be verified by the Department of Transport here in Western Australia against the database. And the government would tell the service provider, credit card application in my example, this person is valid. This person has a legitimate form of identity.
And that's an interesting nuance that you're touching on there, because if we take that then to an adult content setting, the trial is not suggesting that we upload age verification documents to the adult website itself, but rather the adult website employs a relationship with a government, for example, and the government gives you the green light.
So that would be the way that I would approach it. However, we need to consider how these things often get implemented, and Optus would be a great example. Optus had to verify the identity of people when creating new contracts, and would often, typically in store, but also online, would capture, for example, someone's driver's license or passport. You would think they were simply verifying that against a government database, which indeed they did to make sure that it was legitimate. But they then went on to store the details. So, and that ended very badly. So the hope is that a level of sensibility would be applied, and we would ensure that whatever the mechanism is, it is a moment in time verification that did not require the storage of any identification documentation.
Paul, are you getting a sense, just taking into consideration the last couple of weeks we've had as a nation and the national conversation and the way that that has shifted to very rightful calls that we're in crisis mode with this, that these conversations would now be expedited quicker than they usually would be?
I think we're definitely seeing that. And if I go back to what I commented on earlier about the e-safety commissioner, the report I referred to was written a year ago and was processed through government and considered, but not actioned, or at least not in its entirety. So we're going back to 2020 when there were calls for age verification. And this certainly isn't a new thing even then. But in terms of formal calls, this has been asked for certainly as early as 2020 that I'm aware of. But I think there's been a significant shift in public opinion on this matter.
Last question from me, Paul. Have we heard anything from the adult film or entertainment industry when these kind of ideas are floated?
So not specifically in terms of the proposed trial in the media at the moment. However, the E-Safety Commission's report a year ago did draw on evidence from pretty much all stakeholders, and they did talk to the adult entertainment industry. And in a way, this is no different to what has happened in the US and in other countries where age verification has been required, mandated, although not necessarily implemented in the best of ways. So I think there'll be a whole range of responses to this. But the one thing you can guarantee is the adult entertainment industry is not going to disappear because of this.
Professor Paul, I really appreciate your time. That was a really enlightening discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a lovely day.